Sew up this gorgeous pumpkin waffle from HB Creative Studios with me today. I'm going to be using the adult Oakes tee and dress pattern from Petite Stitchery Co. I'm going to be using the top length to make a shirt. I'm going to use color blocked short sleeves. I'm going to add a standard cuff. I'm going to color block the side seams. Down the back bodice, I'm going to add a back seam, and to the front bodice, I'm going to add a chest pocket. I'm going to finish my neckband with a crew neckline, and I'm going to use the exposed seams option included in this pattern. I like finishing the edges of my seams in a contrasting thread when choosing to do exposed seams. I like the pop of color that it adds to the color block. It just creates a funky little accent for whatever piece you're making. Something fun to add to your handmade wardrobe. With a color block option included in this pattern, you have a couple different choices when finishing your seams. I'm choosing to use the open exposed seams so I can add that contrasting thread stitching on the sides so I can get that extra pop of color. There's also an option to do an overlay of exposed seams, or you can choose to finish your color blocking by using just a standard construction. I'm going to add 3 additional color block seams, 1 to each of my side seams and 1 to the hem. I've gone ahead and cut out all the pieces that I need for the pattern. I have my 2 back bodice pieces, my front bodice cut on the fold, my 4 panels for color block sleeves, my 2 cuffs, my pocket, my center color block for the sleeves, my 4 color block panels for the side seams, and my neckband piece. Before I begin constructing the top, I'm going to add the decorative stitching to the seam allowances for the color blocked exposed seam option. Along the bottom of the bodices, both front and back, there's a triangular cutout with a little bit of a seam allowance. That's what I'm going to stitch. Because I like the look of the double lines of serger thread to be exposed, I'm going to sew all of my fabrics that are going to get that decorative stitch with the right side of the fabric facing down. I'm going to repeat the process of sewing that decorative stitch also along the center seams of the back bodice. I don't want the exposed stitch detail on my pocket because I really want the pumpkin print to be the focus, but I am going to go ahead and finish all of the edges of my pocket. The stitch width being 1/4 inch is the perfect guide for when you're folding under your edges, and that extra 1/4 inch stitch across the top is where I'm going to top stitch when I fold the top of my pocket over a 1/2 inch. The next thing I'm going to grab is my front bodice. You can tell it's the front because it has the fold down the middle. And I'm going to go ahead and add that decorative edge stitching along the bottom color block side seams. I'm going to repeat the stitching process on both sides of the front bodice. I plan on doing exposed seams for my cuff. So the next pieces that I'm going to grab are my cuffs, and I'm going to go ahead and add that decorative edge stitching to both sides of my cuffs. So when I sew them together and I open them up, I'm going to get that solid white that's going to contrast with that beigey tan color and the pumpkin print. The next pieces that I'm going to grab are going to be my 2 sets of sleeves. I'm going to go ahead and add that decorative edge stitching to the long straight edges of all 4 pieces. The color block panel is going to go in between 2 of those sleeves. I'm going to finish up edge stitching my pieces for my sleeves. I'm going to grab my color block panels, the centers for the sleeves, and because I'm going to join both on the right and the left side, I'm going to sew that decorative edge stitching on both the right and left sides of this panel. When I added that decorative stitching to my seams, I did just sew continuous chain. So now I'm going back through and separating each pattern piece. And while I'm doing that, I'm also giving each piece a quick once over, making sure that all of the seams that I wanted that decorative stitching on have that decorative stitching in place. The last pieces that I have to add that decorative edge stitching to are going to be the triangular panels that are going to be the color blocking for the front and the back bodice. The last time I made this top, I used exposed seams for the front of the bodice and I exposed the side seams. For this top, I'm not going to expose the side seams, so in reality, I didn't really need to finish the long straight edge of the triangle. So don't do that if you're sewing along here with me. Everything has had the decorative stitching added to it. I got my sleeve cuffs, my sleeves, the color block panel for my sleeves. I have my front bodice and the color blocks for the front bodice. And then I have my pocket all edge stitched, and I have my back bodice with the panels for my back bodice all finished nice. Now that I have all of my decorative stitching done, it's finally time to construct the garment. I'm going to start with the color block sleeves. Now, in typical garment construction, you would match your fabrics with the right sides together. But because we are going for the exposed seam look, we are actually going to attach our fabrics with the wrong sides together. All of the construction for the exposed seams is done on a regular sewing machine. You're going to want to use a triple straight stitch, and you're going to sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Straight away, you're going to notice that I don't have any pins or clips aligning my fabrics together. I find that it's easier to keep the fabrics in alignment with each other and maintain that 3/8 inch seam allowance throughout the construction piece without these. Because of the bulk of the seams, they have a tendency to shift and twist. And I find if I sew little by little, I can realign them, and it gives me that nice straight 3/8 inch line when I open my seams. Once I finish attaching them, I always like to open it up and take a peek, make sure everything looks good. And then it's time to move on to the other half of the color block. Again, you're gonna do wrong sides together, and you're gonna construct this the same way you just constructed the other side. Once you've attached that other side, you will have one full sleeve with that color block panel in the middle. The back is going to be flat, and the front is going to have your edge stitching with those beautiful exposed seams. And then we'll move on. We're going to construct the second sleeve in the same exact way that we constructed the previous sleeve. These sleeve caps do not have a front and back, so you really don't need to make sure that you're sewing the front to a certain angle of the color block and the back to the back angle of the color block. The next pieces that I'm going to grab are going to be my front bodice and the two color block triangles that go down there at the bottom. We are going to join the angled edge of the triangle to the angled edge of the bodice, and we are going to stick those together with the wrong sides together. We're going to use our triple straight stitch, and we're going to sew it with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. You're gonna notice again, just like when I sewed the sleeves, I am not using pins or clips. Again, it's just personal preference. If you feel more comfortable using those, please by all means go ahead and do that. Once you have attached that panel, you're going to have the same thing like the sleeves, the flat back, and then that exposed seam on the front. And then you're going to go ahead and sew the other side of the color block to your front bodice piece. Now that I have sewn all 3 pieces of my front bodice together, I'm going to grab the 4 pieces that I need for my back bodice. It's going to be the right and left panels for the back bodice, and then both the left and right lower color block triangles. I'm going to sew those together the same way that I sewed the color block triangles to the front bodice. Once I have joined both triangles to their respective panels for the back bodice, the next thing I'm going to do is attach the back bodice panels to each other along that center seam. Again, they go with the wrong sides together. These get sewn with that same 3/8 inch seam allowance using that triple straight stitch on your sewing machine. As the amount of fabric pieces grows smaller, my excitement gets larger. It just means it's all coming together. Here I have both my finished color block sleeves and both my finished front and back bodice pieces. The next thing I'm going to do, so rewarding, is open up all of these exposed seams. This is where I really take the time to appreciate that decorative edge stitching, the contrast of the white thread on that beige, brown, tan. I'm still not sure what color it is. It's so satisfying. So I'm going to go ahead and press open all of these seams. I wiggle my iron back and forth a little bit as I go, just to make sure that it's fully opened in the center. Just continue that process until you have all of your seams pressed open. Because I added the detailing to this top with that edge stitching on the exposed seams, constructing this garment actually took a lot longer than I was anticipating. Between cutting and sewing and filming, I'm at about 3 hours dedicated to this project. not including the cut and tape of the pattern, and then fussy cutting the fabric pieces because it was a directional print. This sewed up like a woven would. A good slow sew with attention to detail. Those kind of sews are so satisfying to me. It helps me to enjoy the process. It really reignites my sojo, so to speak. Just, I don't know. So pleasing. When I said that I was only going to do those 3 additional exposed seams on my sleeve cuffs and on my hem, I was wrong. I actually want to do exposed shoulder seams. So I'm going to take these bodice pieces over to my serger and do that decorative edge stitch on those as well. Remember when I said don't sew that straight edge on the triangle if you're not going to do exposed side seams? I forgot, and I actually did the decorative stitching on the top parts of my bodice too. Unnecessary step because I wasn't exposing the side seams, and it really just ended up creating unnecessary bulk in the end. So don't do that unless you're doing exposed side seams. Now that I have added that decorative edge stitching to my shoulder seams, I am going to join my front and back bodices together. Again, because I want that exposed seam, I'm going to match my wrong sides together. And again, because of the decorative edge stitching, I'm not going to use pins or clips to hold my fabric into place. Take it to your sewing machine, use a 3/8 inch seam allowance and that triple straight stitch to join these. Okay, friends, time for the good stuff. I'm going to start to sew my exposed seams down into place. Like I said in the beginning of the video, I like to use the stitch where the double serger threads are exposed because I use those as a guide. So I will either sew along the furthest one from the center or in between the two. Now I had pressed open all of my other exposed seams previously, except I just sewed these shoulder seams, and because they're so short, I am able to finger press these to get them open. So what I'm going to do is use a long straight stitch. I think I used about a 3, and I'm just going to sew along the edge to secure it down so it stays open. And I'm going to do that on both sides of the seams. And then I'm going to go over to my other shoulder seam and repeat the process. Because I still have the bodice in my hands, I'm just going to start stitching down the open exposed seams. I'm going to start with that center seam that's down the back. Still using the 3 length stitch, and I'm making sure that I sew both sides of the stitch down on either side of the center line. Once I've finished sewing down all those seams on my bodice, I'm going to grab my sleeves and sew down those exposed seams. Remember to make sure you get both sides of the seam on either side of that center line. So I will be sewing down 4 straight stitches here on each sleeve. Now that I've top stitched all of my open exposed seams, I'm going to be pressing my pocket. This is where that 1/4 inch stitch width that I placed before will work as a guide for pressing. I'm going to press both sides and the bottom a 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to fold my top down a 1/2 inch, and when I go to top stitch it, I'm going to top stitch right along that 1/4 inch stitch width that I have on the back side. When I cut my pieces, I did not mark pocket placement. So I'm going to lay out my front bodice and use the edges that haven't been sewn together to place my pattern piece on top of it. Because I've sewn this pattern before, I've already cut my pocket flap, but I like to cut 3 edges of the pocket guide and use it as like a window, and then I will place my pocket inside of it. Just so happened that I got perfect pattern placement with the print. Completely unintentional. I just cut the pocket from a scrap of fabric I had. But when the prints match up, the satisfaction is almost unmatched. Here's a trick. I like to use my handy dandy glue stick to help me keep my pocket in place when attaching it. I'm gonna put just a little bit, just enough to keep it attached to the fabric along the edges. So I'll do that and I'll press it, and then I like to give it a little bit of time to dry so it doesn't really gum up my needles. There are a couple ways you can reinforce the corners of your pockets. I've seen bar tacks, I've seen like triangles for reinforcement. I am going to use a tall, narrow zigzag stitch. So I'm going to start at the top of the pocket flap and I'm going to zigzag. I do, I don't know, a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch. And then I switch to a long straight stitch as you would use for top stitching. And then I top stitch down along that edge. And then when I get to the bottom corner, I leave my needle down and I lift my presser foot and I turn my fabric. Then I lower my presser foot again, and then I sew along that bottom edge until I get to the other corner. And then I'm going to leave my needle down again, lift my presser foot, and then turn the fabric again so I can sew up the other side. Now, once I get to, I don't know, a 1/2 inch to a 1/4 inch away from the top of the pocket flap, I'm then going to raise my presser foot and switch back to that zigzag stitch that I used on the other side. Once I have finished sewing my pocket one, I'm going to go to the wrong side of the bodice and I'm going to secure my threads. I like to pull on the bobbin thread, and usually if the stitch tension isn't too much, the top thread will poke through, and then I will grab the top thread and the bottom thread once they're both on the other side and tie a few hand knots into it. On the other side of the pocket flap, the tail didn't want to come through, so I had to go and grab a needle and I just poked it right through in stitches so they would line up, and then tied that, and then once they were tied, I just trimmed down the tails. The next thing I'm going to do is form the sleeve cuffs, or the sleeve bands rather, because it's a short sleeve. I want these to have exposed seams on them. So I am going to sew them 3/8 of an inch with a triple straight stitch down those short edges with the wrong sides together. Because I missed this step with sewing these to have open exposed seams earlier, I also missed sewing it down, so I'm going to go just switch my settings real quick to that long straight stitch of 3, and I'm going to finger press these seams open and sew down these seams. Perfect opportunity to remind you to make sure your bobbin still has thread on it. I barely just one bobbin chicken here, so now I need to go wind another bobbin before I finish up these cuffs. I am now going to quarter my sleeve band. I'm going to use the center line of the open exposed seams as 1/4 point. I'm going to stretch my fabric and find the exact opposite edge of that and use that as another 1/4 point. After I have those 2 1/4 points, I'm going to place those 2 points together, and then I'm going to find the center of the difference of each of those to get my other 2 1/4 points. I have switched my machines back out. I'm now going to go back to my serger. I'm gonna sew the side seam for the sleeves. I'm going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and because I don't want these seams to be exposed, I am going to sew these with the right sides of the fabric together. Because these seams that I need to sew are only a couple inches long, I'm not going to use pins or clips, but generally when I do have a longer stretch of stitching that I need to use, I will use clips. As you can tell, my lighting has changed because it is now dark outside. Time to get these bands sewn to the sleeves. Because I used a directional print, when I attach my bands to my sleeves, I need to make sure that when the band is flipped down, the direction of the print is going the same way. So I'm going to clip it together first to make sure when I flip it down that the pumpkins are sitting the way they're supposed to be. I'm going to use the side seam from the sleeve as one of my quarter points. And I'm going to use the exposed seam from my band as the opposite quarter point for that. The effect that I'm looking for is that the exposed seam from the band will fall in the center of the color blocked panel that's on the sleeve. So I will match those up and then match the other 2 points up with the clips that I already have in place around the sleeve. This pattern is designed that there's not really much tension between the sleeve and the band when it's together. So with the tiniest amount of stretching of the band, I'm going to attach the band to the sleeve. I finished sewing both bands to both sleeves, so now I have 2 completed sleeves. The next thing I'm going to do is sew my front bodice to my back bodice along the side seam here. You can see that the top of my bodice still has the white edge stitching on it. And then where the color shift happens, there's the edge stitching along the bottom color block piece. I'm clipping where those 2 fabrics shift colors because I want them to have a nice crisp edge where they meet, and clipping will help ensure that that's where I need to focus when I'm sewing. Because I decided that I didn't want the edge stitching, I'm going to end up cutting most of it off as I serge these 2 seams together. I repeated that same construction for the other side, so now my bodice is a full bodice. Both side seams are sewn. The next thing I'm gonna grab is my neckband. So I'm gonna join my neckband with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. The fabrics do have a different weight. The neckband has more stretch, obviously, to allow it to go on and off your head easier. So the edges did curl a little bit, so I just need to pay a little bit more attention to that, smooth out the curls as I put it through the needles. And then I'm going to quarter my neckband. So I like to line up the seam and then I'll clip it in the middle and then I'll stretch it out, and opposite of that, I will clip the middle on the other side. But then to reduce bulk, I also like to snip into the stitches and offset the seams. So I'll have one set of seams to the left and one set of seams to the right. It helps the fabric to lay a little flatter and reduces the amount of bulk on the back of the neckband. Next, I'm going to quarter the neckline on my bodice. I am going to use that center open exposed seam in the back as one of my quarter points. I'm going to use that line right in the center, and I'm going to go directly opposite of that, and that's going to be my second quarter point. And then I'm going to place those 2 points together to find the middle of the difference. Now, I don't know if you knew this or not, but your shoulder seams aren't always necessarily a quarter point. Like here, my shoulder seams are, I don't know, maybe 1.5 inches off of where my quarter points are. So just something to keep in mind. And then I'm going to take my neckband and line up the quarter points with my neckband to my neckline. I joined the seam that's on the neckband to the seam, the exposed seam in the back of my bodice, and I'm going to gently stretch my neckband as I sew from point to point. Once I have attached my neckband to the neckline of my bodice, I'm going to attach my sleeves. So I like to offset the seams of my sleeves to the seams of my bodice. So whichever direction it ended up falling after I serged it, I'm going to line that up with my bodice seam in the opposite direction. I'm going to clip these together, and then I will find the center of my sleeve cap, and I will match that to my shoulder seam. Because of the design of this shirt, it should look like the exposed seams are falling directly in the center of the collar block panel on the sleeve. When setting in my sleeves, I always like to check to see how much I need to stretch my sleeve to the bodice before going straight to the machine. So for my first sleeve, I will check to see how much stretch I need. And this is pretty much a 1-for-1. There's basically no stretching that I need to do to the sleeve to get it to fit into the arm side. So for my second sleeve, I didn't pin because I knew I didn't need to stretch as I went. But to join these, I just went with, I used the 3 seam allowance and just went pretty slow over the bulk of the seams just to make sure everything stayed aligned. Okay, friends, we're almost finished. This is the last step. So I wanted to do an exposed hem. An exposed hem, I'm sure there's a couple different ways you could do it, but this is the easiest way for me to do it because I don't have a cover stitch and I don't like fussing with twin needles. I didn't have the patience to do that. So what I'm going to do is make a faux cuff essentially and then top stitch it down so it looks like it's an exposed hem. So the hem allowance for this pattern is 1 inch. So I am going to take my hem edge and I'm going to fold it up. So right sides together 1 inch to create the 1 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to tack it in place with glue. No, my iron is not on. You don't want to melt your fabric. Don't leave your iron sitting on your fabric. I'm just using it as a weight so I can get ready here. But I'm going to use glue to tack it in place, and I'm also going to use clips to tack it in place. Before I clip, I will press the seam, and I'm going to continue this all the way around the bottom edge of the bodice. Now that I have pressed my seam allowance up 1 inch all the way around the bottom hem edge, I'm going to fold it back onto itself. So creating an accordion fold essentially. So I'm going to clip along that folded edge all the way around before I take it to my machine. Now that I'm at my machine, I'm going to disengage the blade on my serger because I don't want to cut anything off. What I'm doing is sewing a seam that's going to join the bottom edge 1 inch into the bodice. Because my serger blade is disengaged, it's not going to cut off any of those extra tails that I have from the exposed seams. So I'm going to snip those before I get to the needle. But as you can see, everything's lined up. The raw edge is lined up on that fold, and I'm just going right along that edge and I'm joining it, creating that faux cuff look. What I'm going to do now is take my iron and I'm going to press that seam allowance up towards the bodice. I'm going to do that all the way around the bottom edge of the bodice. And that seam allowance is what I'm going to top stitch down in place. Because this top stitch is going to go around the width of our body and we want some stretch to it, I'm going to top stitch this with a triple straight stitch on my sewing machine. Now I'm going to put it right in those 2 serger threads that I love to use as my guide when I'm doing these exposed seams here. Because of the bulk of it, you're going to need to go slow and you might have to pull a little bit or lift the front of your presser foot to get over the bulge. When I've finally gotten all the way back around to where I started, I'm going to pull my bobbin thread, just like I did with the pocket, to get that top thread to pop out. And I'm going to hand tie these, just like I did with the pockets. Now, when you use a triple straight stitch, it does have a tendency to stretch the fabric a little bit, and it can give you these wavy seams. I've found that some fabrics recover better than others with just the heat of the iron, but there are some fabrics where you may need to hit it with a little bit of steam to get those wavy seams to relax a little bit. I'm just going to go over and hit all of my seams with some heat and press them flat. Time to admire this labor of love here, friends. Look at these gorgeous open exposed seams. I love the extra touch that edge stitching adds, that little pop of color with the contrasting thread on your color blocks. This is such a beautiful piece, and it's such a comfortable top, and it's perfect for wear all year round. I hope y'all enjoyed sewing this up with me. Maybe even learned a few tips and tricks along the way. I can't wait to see the kind of oaks you created. Be sure to share it over in the Sewing Hub. I'll see you guys later.